A peaceful neighborhood stroll turns into chaos when one woman's shocking accusation flips the script. What unfolds will leave you speechless. It was a picture-perfect Saturday afternoon in Greenville, South Carolina. The kind of day where the sunlight danced through the tree branches, casting playful patterns on the pavement. Darren loved these afternoons. He had a passion for uncovering the stories behind the architecture and landscapes of his town. With a camera slung over his shoulder and a small notebook in hand, he wandered the quiet streets, pausing every now and then to admire the intricate details of a Victorian porch or the unique brickwork on an old church. Darren's hobby wasn't just about history. It was his way of connecting with his community, documenting its charm and sharing it on his blog. Over time, he had earned a modest following of local readers who appreciated his insights and photographs. He often received emails from older residents thanking him for preserving the town's heritage in such a personal way. This afternoon, however, felt a little different. As Darren strolled along Sycamore Avenue, he noticed a woman staring at him from behind a lace curtain. Her eyes bore into him like she was trying to solve a puzzle. He offered a polite wave, but she didn't respond. Instead, the curtain snapped shut, leaving him with a lingering feeling of discomfort. He brushed it aside and kept walking, stopping to snap a photo of an old oak tree that stood proudly in the middle of a yard. Inside her house, Linda paced the living room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. "There's a man walking up and down the street," she hissed into the receiver. "He's been lingering near houses, taking pictures. I'm sure he's scouting the neighborhood. You need to send someone over." The operator on the other end tried to reassure her, but Linda wouldn't hear it. To her, Darren's behavior was suspicious, and she was determined to stop whatever she imagined he was planning. Unaware of the call, Darren moved further down the street, admiring a quaint craftsman-style home. He crouched slightly to get the perfect angle for his photo, oblivious to the growing tension brewing behind closed doors. The quiet, suburban charm of Sycamore Avenue was about to shatter. But before Darren could even snap his next picture, the sound of sirens echoed down the street. And what happened next was nothing short of jaw-dropping. The sirens grew louder, breaking the tranquil atmosphere of the neighborhood. Darren straightened up, puzzled, as two police cruisers rounded the corner and came to a stop just a few feet away. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the nearby houses, casting an eerie glow across the pristine lawns. Neighbors peeked out from windows and doorways, their curiosity piqued by the sudden commotion. Darren's confusion turned to unease as two officers stepped out of their vehicles and began walking toward him. "Good afternoon, sir," one of them said, his tone professional but guarded. "Can we have a word with you?" "Of course," Darren replied, his voice steady but unsure of what was happening. He set his camera and notebook down on the sidewalk, raising his hands slightly to show he had nothing to hide. "Is there a problem?" The officer glanced at his partner before speaking. "We received a call about someone behaving suspiciously in the area. Do you live around here?" Darren's brows furrowed suspiciously. "I'm just taking photos for my blog. I document historical homes and architecture in the area." He gestured to his camera and notebook as evidence of his claim. Before the officers could respond, Linda appeared on her porch, her face flushed with indignation. "That's him," she called out, pointing a trembling finger in Darren's direction. "I saw him walking back and forth, looking at houses and taking pictures. He's planning something, I just know it." Darren's jaw dropped. "Planning something, ma'am?" I'm just walking and taking photos. That's all, but Linda wasn't backing down. Don't let him fool you, she insisted, her voice rising with each word. I've seen this before. They come around pretending to be harmless and then bam. Break-ins all over the place. The officers exchanged a glance, their postures tense. Sir, one of them said, turning back to Darren. We're going to need to see some ID. And hear more about what you're doing here. Darren complied, pulling out his wallet and handing over his driver's license as the officers examined it. More neighbors began to emerge from their homes, forming a small crowd on the sidewalk. Among them was Mrs. Donovan, an elderly woman with a kind face, who lived a few houses down. What's going on here, she asked, her voice cutting through the growing murmur of the crowd. She recognized Darren immediately. Oh, that's Darren. He writes the blog about Greenville's history. I've seen his posts, he's harmless. Linda turned to Mrs. Donovan, her expression a mix of irritation and disbelief. Harmless? You can't know that for sure. Just because he writes a blog doesn't mean he's not up to something. Mrs. Donovan frowned, stepping closer to Darren. I do know that for sure. He's been documenting our neighborhood for months. And I've even helped him with research. You're making a big mistake. The officers, sensing the growing tension, held up their hands to calm everyone down. Let's all take a step back, one of them said. We're just trying to figure out what's going on here. But as more neighbors began to take sides, the situation spiraled out of control, revealing much more than anyone expected. The tension in the air was palpable. As the crowd grew larger, neighbors whispered to one another, their voices a mixture of curiosity and concern. Some sided with Linda, convinced her vigilance was justified, while others nodded along with Mrs. Donovan, defending Darren's intentions. The atmosphere felt like a powder keg, ready to explode with the slightest spark. Look, officers, Darren said calmly, though frustration was beginning to seep into his tone. I've lived in Greenville for years. I'm passionate about documenting this town's history. That's all this is about. He held up his camera again. You're welcome to check the photos. It's nothing but houses and landmarks. One officer gestured for Darren to hand over the camera, which he did without hesitation. The officer flipped through the images. Photos of old houses, an antique lamppost, a weathered mailbox. It was clear there was nothing incriminating. But Linda wasn't backing down. Of course, he wouldn't take pictures of anything suspicious. She snapped. He's smart enough to cover his tracks. That's enough, Linda, Mrs. Donovan interjected, her voice firm. You've always been quick to judge people, but this is too far. Darren has done nothing wrong. Linda folded her arms, her jaw tightening. And what if I'm right? What if in a week someone's house gets broken into? Will you all thank me? Then the murmurs in the crowd grew louder, with more neighbors joining in. A younger couple, Mia and Jared, stepped forward. We've read Darren's blog. Mia said he spotlighted a lot of our town's history. Honestly, we're grateful for what he does. Exactly, Jared added. Linda, you can't just assume the worst about someone because you don't recognize them. Linda's face turned red, but she stood her ground. It's not about recognizing him. It's about being cautious. You can't be too careful these days. The crowd was now fully split. On one side were those who defended Darren, citing his contributions to the community and his obvious innocence. On the other were those who, like Linda, felt his actions were suspicious and warranted concern. The officers found themselves in the middle of the brewing storm, trying to maintain order. Everyone, please calm down, one officer said, his voice firm but diplomatic. We're just here to ensure everyone's safety. No one is under arrest, we're just gathering information. Darren shook his head, his patience wearing thin. I get being cautious, he said. Addressing the crowd, but what's happening right now? This isn't caution, it's something else entirely. His words hung in the air. Heavy with implication, the crowd fell silent. Some looking down, others exchanging uneasy glances. Mrs. Donovan stepped closer to Darren, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. This isn't right, she said softly, but loud enough for the others to hear. We're better than this, aren't we? And just when it seemed the situation couldn't escalate further, someone in the crowd decided to speak up. And what they said changed everything. From the back of the crowd, a voice broke the uneasy silence. This feels wrong and we all know it. The speaker was Tom, a retired school principal, known for his calm demeanor and sense of fairness. He stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. I've seen Darren around, I've read his blog. The only thing he's guilty of is appreciating our community more than most of us do. Linda scoffed, her arms still crossed. So we're just supposed to ignore suspicious behavior? That's how people get hurt. Tom turned to Linda, his tone measured but firm. Suspicious to who, Linda? Darren hasn't done anything illegal or harmful. He's just walking and taking photos. What makes that a threat? The weight of Tom's words settled over the crowd. Slowly others began to nod in agreement. Even those who had initially sided with Linda started to reconsider. The truth was plain to see. Darren was being unfairly targeted. And the reasons behind it weren't sitting well with anyone. Linda, however, wasn't ready to back down. It's easy for you to say, Tom. You didn't see him the way I did. Creeping around, acting like he owned the place. Creeping around, Darren interjected, his voice tinged with disbelief. I was walking on the sidewalk taking photos of houses. That's not creeping, that's public space. The crowd murmured again. But this time the tone had shifted. The unease wasn't directed at Darren anymore. It was directed at Linda, her words, once bolstered by fear and suspicion, now sounded hollow in the face of logic and fairness. Then Mrs. Donovan spoke again, her voice carrying an undeniable authority. Linda, this isn't about being cautious. This is about you jumping to conclusions. Because Darren doesn't fit your idea of who belongs here, and that's not okay. Linda's face flushed a deep red. And for the first time she seemed at a loss for words. The crowd watched her, waiting for her response. But none came. One of the officers cleared his throat. Breaking the tension, we've reviewed the situation. And there's no evidence of any wrongdoing here. Darren, you're free to go. Darren let out a breath. He didn't realize he'd been holding. Thank you, he said, his voice steady but weary. He turned to the crowd. And thank you to those who stood up for me. It means more than you know. As Darren began to walk away, the crowd lingered. Conversations buzzed quietly. But the tone had changed. People weren't just discussing what had happened. They were reflecting on it. The incident had shone a light on something uncomfortable but necessary to address. But before Darren could leave, one final voice from the crowd stopped him in his tracks, turning the moment into something no one would ever forget. As Darren walked away, a soft voice called out from the crowd, stopping him mid-step. It was Mia, the young woman who had defended him earlier. Darren, wait, she said, stepping forward. Before you go, I think we all owe you an apology. Her words hung in the air. And for a moment no one moved. Then, to everyone's surprise, Linda hesitated before taking a step closer. Her face was still red, but now it was a mix of embarrassment and something that resembled regret. She's right, Linda said quietly. her voice trembling. I owe you an apology. The crowd fell silent, all eyes on Linda. I jumped to conclusions, she admitted. Her words slow and deliberate. I let my fear cloud my judgment. And I'm sorry for that, I was wrong. Darren turned to face her. His expression unreadable. He didn't respond right away, letting her words sink in. Finally, he nodded. Thank you, he said simply. His tone measured. But this isn't just about me. It's about how easy it is to let fear take over. To see someone as a threat. Just because they're unfamiliar. Linda's shoulders sagged, her gaze dropping to the ground. I'll do better, she murmured. I have to at that moment. Mrs. Donovan stepped forward, addressing the entire crowd. We all have to do better, she said, her voice strong and unwavering. This isn't just about one person or one incident. It's about how we treat each other. How we see each other. We can't let fear or prejudice dictate our actions. Tom nodded in agreement. We need to make this a turning point. He said, let's not let this moment pass without learning something from it. The crowd murmured in agreement. And an idea began to form. A plan to hold regular community meetings. Not just to address concerns, but to foster understanding and unity. Darren, though still shaken, agreed to be a part of the first meeting, sharing his perspective and helping others see the value of empathy and open-mindedness. Linda quietly promised to attend too. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the crowd dispersed, Darren walked away with a mix of emotions: relief, frustration, and a glimmer of hope. What had started as a walk around the neighborhood had turned into something far more significant. A wake-up call for an entire community. This story reminds us of the importance of looking beyond our assumptions and choosing understanding over fear. If you've ever felt the sting of being judged unfairly, or witnessed someone else being treated this way, let this be a call to action. Stand up, speak out, and strive to be the change your community needs. And don't forget, stories like this matter. Subscribe for more and join the conversation. Together we can make a difference.